Chapter 2. Can the sun rise in the west? Dirty frogs want to feed on crane. Poor scum hope for great happenings in vain. Look at yourself in some ditch water, do. What great deeds can be done by the likes of you? Can snow fall in mid-July? Can the sun rise in the western sky? Landlord Sui, from the opera Wang Kui and Li Xiangxiang. Longbow village shared in the turbulent history of feudal China. Footnote. Many scholars use the word feudal to describe only the vassal, lord, serf, and manor system characteristic of medieval Europe. In this book, the word is used in a broader sense to describe a society in which a ruling class, basing its power on the private ownership of and control over land, lived off a share of the produce extracted from that land by a class of laboring people. The latter, though neither slaves nor serfs, were still so closely bound to the land which they cultivated as to make them little better than serfs of the landed proprietors. It was a society, furthermore, in which these two classes constituted the main social forces and determined the contours of development. Over the centuries, the empire was many times invaded and twice conquered from without. From within, the body politic was rocked by violent rebellion no less than 18 times. Province-wide and country-wide revolts were too numerous to record, but neither conquest nor rebellion altered the basic contours of society. The invaders were pastoral nomads who grafted themselves onto the apex of the country's power structure without modifying its base. The rebels were most of them peasants. Even though these peasants several times brought dynasties low, they proved historically unable to establish any alternative to the emperor-ruled landlord-tenant system. After each upheaval, life returned once again to the old way. Even the century of mounting crisis and change that began for China with the British-imposed Opium War of 1840 failed to shatter, though it certainly weakened, the hold of the gentry over China's good earth and the peasants who tilled it. As late as 1945, many gentry in the interior still could not conceive of basic change as possible. Families might rise and fall, rebel armies advance or retreat, new gods challenge old, machine textiles replace hand-woven goods, steam and electricity replace man and mule in distant ports. But in the quiet countryside, landlords continued to don long gowns, collect exorbitant rents, pay off the soldiery, manicure their fingernails, and eat white flour made from wheat. Tenants continued to wear dirt-stained trousers, sweat in the fields, render up the major part of what they raised in taxes and rent, and shiver through the winter on coarse millet, chaff, and bran. When anyone mentioned change, the gentry asked confidently, "Can the sun rise in the west?" This confidence of the gentry was based on the stability of the land system and the culture it engendered, a system and a culture that had survived and often flourished since before the time of Christ. Under this system, which in one decade abruptly disappeared forever from mainland China, a typical community was made up of a small number of landlords and rich peasants, and a large number of hired laborers, poor peasants, and middle peasants. Footnote. Those who possess a great deal of land, who do not themselves labor, but depend entirely on exploiting the peasants through rent and usury, sustaining themselves without toiling, these are the landlords. Those who own large amounts of land, plow animals, and farm implements, who themselves take part in labor, although at the same time they exploit the hired labor of peasants, these are the rich peasants. Those who have land, plow animals, and farm implements, who labor themselves and do not exploit others, or do so only slightly, these are the middle peasants. Those who have only a small amount of land, farm implements, and plow animals, who labor on their own land but at the same time have to sell a part of their labor power, these are the poor peasants. Those who have no land, plow animals, or farm implements, and who must sell their labor power, these are the hired laborers. From Jen P. Shi, Several Problems Regarding Land Reform, 1948, not published in English. The landlords and rich peasants, who made up less than 10% of the rural population, owned from 70 to 80% of the land, most of the draft animals, and the bulk of the carts and implements. The hired laborers, the poor peasants, and the middle peasants, who made up more than 90% of the population, held less than 30% of the land, only a few draft animals, and a scattering of implements and carts, a condition which placed them perennially at the mercy of the more well-to-do, and condemned them to a life of veritable serfdom. If one takes the percentages above as a yardstick, one finds that the people of Longbow were more fortunate than the average, for the concentration of land ownership there in the early 1940s was not nearly as high as was general in other parts of China, or even in other parts of the Shantung region. On the eve of the land revolution, the landlords and the rich peasants together made up about 7% of the population and owned directly 164 acres, or 18% of the land. Through religious and clan associations, they controlled another 114 acres, bringing the total land under their control to 278 acres, or 31%. They also owned 18 oxen, mules, and donkeys, or about 33% of the draft animals. These were low figures compared to many other Chinese communities. If the landlords and rich peasants held less than was usual, the middle peasants held much more. They made up 40% of the population, held 45% of the land, and 66% of the draft animals. Even so, they were not the largest group in the village. The poor peasants outnumbered all others, with 47% of the population. They held only 24% of the land. 6% of the people were hired laborers. The two most exploited groups thus made up more than half of the population, owned less than a quarter of the land, and only 5% of the draft animals. Very interesting and significant was the factor of family size. The landlords and the rich peasants averaged more than 5 persons per household, the middle peasants fewer than 5, the poor peasants between 3 and 3.5, and the hired laborers about 3. There was thus a direct correlation between the size of the family and its basic economic security measured in terms of productive property. Although the birth rate in all established families was approximately the same, those with land, tools, and stock were able to maintain larger families and prosper. Those without land or with very small holdings were often unable even to marry. If they did marry, they were unable to hold their families together, lost more children to disease and famine, had to sell children, or even sell wives, and thus had households about half the size. If the land holdings of the pre-revolutionary period were calculated on the basis of the number of families, rather than per capita, the concentration of wealth in the hands of the landlords and rich peasants was more marked. On that basis, a very realistic one for China, where the traditional emphasis has always been on the family rather than on the individual, the landlords and rich peasants, with only 5% of the families, controlled 31% of the land. The middle peasants, with less than a third of the families, held 45% of the land. And the poor peasants and hired laborers together, with 62% of the families, held only 24% of the land. Even on this basis, the concentration of land ownership in Longbow was not high. The landlords and rich peasants were relatively poor, and the middle peasant group was unusually large, a factor which was to have considerable influence on the whole future of the community. One reason for the comparative dispersion of land ownership was the poor quality of the land. Whereas in many parts of China it took only half an acre or less to support one person, in the southern districts of Lucheng County, it took about 1 acre. Irrigation easily could have doubled yields, but without large-scale engineering projects, no general irrigation was possible, even on the flat that surrounded the village. In addition, a good part of the land, at least 1/3, was on the hill, and therefore impossible to irrigate. The whole region, located at the very end of Shanxi's fertile central valley, only a few miles from high, often rocky mountains, was extremely high and cold, and hence a peripheral area agriculturally. In general, in every country in the world, the highest concentration of landholding is to be found in the richest, most fertile valleys, and the lowest concentration in the poorest mountain regions, where the surplus possible from one man's labor is least, and hence the rate of exploitation is the lowest. The mountainous regions of southeastern Shanxi were no exception to this rule. The land held by the landlords and rich peasants, while ample, was not enough in itself to make them the dominant group in the village. It served primarily as a solid foundation for other forms of open and concealed exploitation, which taken together raised a handful of families far above the rest of the inhabitants economically, and hence politically and socially as well. Usurious interest rates on loans, profits from commercial and industrial ventures, the spoils of public office, and graft or commissions from the management of temple, church, and clan affairs, when added to the revenues from land ownership and land management, gave these families an influence in gross disproportion to their numbers or to the acreage which they held. Longbow's richest family, the 7-member household of the landlord Sheng Qing Ho, tapped every one of these income sources. Sheng Qing Ho was a healthy, able-bodied man, but he never engaged in any form of manual labor. He did not have to. His income was many times that of the most prosperous middle peasant family. He cultivated long fingernails, wore a long gown that made manual work impossible, and considered it beneath his dignity even to lift his bag onto his cart when he went on a trip. The heart of Qing Ho's empire consisted of 23 acres of fertile land, the largest holding in the village, if one excludes the land of the Carry-On Society of the Catholic Church. Footnote. For a description of this society and its operations, see Chapter 5. To work these acres, he hired 2 year-round laborers, plus extra hands at harvest time. In livestock, the second most important category of rural wealth, he owned 2 draft animals, a flock of sheep, and several hogs. He employed 2 boys full-time to look after the sheep. His industrial enterprise was a small distillery where picar was made from Kalyang grain. The wine cost about 20 cents a caddy to make and sold for about 30 cents a caddy. Footnote. A caddy is equal to half a kilogram, or 1.1 English pounds. When in full production, this distillery turned out over 100 caddies a day. In this plant, Qing Ho employed 2 men for about 7 months every year. The distiller's grains left over from the process were fed to fattening hogs. The income from these enterprises was fairly large, and since the family lived very frugally, Sheng Qing Ho had a yearly surplus. Some of this surplus he converted into silver coin, which he buried in the back part of his courtyard. Another part he invested in a distillery owned by another landlord, Fan Pu Tu. The rest he loaned out to peasants in desperate need, and, by charging exorbitant interest rates, up to 50% a month, often doubled or tripled his principal in one season. Those who were unable to pay lost their land to him. If they had no land, they lost their livestock, their carts, their implements. This loan business was actually run by his wife, a woman with a very sharp business head who kept careful track of every copper coin. With his wife in command of the loans, Qing Ho himself had plenty of time for such equally lucrative operations as managing the affairs of the Pei Lao Shi or North Temple Society, a charitable organization set up to help support the village school, lend money to members in distress, give insurance-type benefits, and placate the gods. This was a Buddhist religious group to which many peasants contributed money and grain. The society owned about 5 acres of land, which Qing Ho managed. He also ran the group's annual fair and hired the traveling players who staged the opera, without which no fair could be called a success. Since Qing Ho was in charge of all the funds, it was a simple matter for him to deduct a suitable commission. It was also a simple matter for him to arrange the accounts in such a way that the amount written down as the cost of the entertainment was always greatly in excess of the sum actually spent. He pocketed the difference. Once every 40 years, the North Temple Society sponsored an especially grand fair. On such occasions, much more money was spent, and Qing Ho's share, when this fete finally fell to him, was proportionately greater. He himself confessed that he made more than 500 silver dollars on this one big fair alone. Footnote. The silver dollars mentioned in this book are worth about 50 cents in U.S. currency. As a fertility and good luck offering to the gods, each member of the North Temple Society had to pay annually a certain amount of grain per acre. All this grain went to Qing Ho's home and eventually found its way to his distillery. No accounting for this wealth was ever made to the people. Concerning the manager of a similar temple society in South China, the well-known sociologist Fei Xiaotung has this to say. He is theoretically selected by common consent. In practice, the position is held in rotation by influential men of the village by their common consent. The invariable practice of ignoring the poor in questions of administration is justified by the statement that their poverty disqualified them, since they could not reimburse the public coffers were they to make mistakes. It is impossible to say how much profit accrues to the treasurer, for, since the only concern of the people is that the traditional functions be performed, there's no system of auditing or making public his accounts. Footnote. Fei Xiaotung and Chang Qi, Earthbound China, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1947, page 55. By no means a man to place all his eggs in one basket, Qing Ho also headed a Kung Tzu Tao Confucian Association of the whole 5th District. The Confucians of 30 villages were under his leadership. In Longbow, the overwhelming majority of the people belonged to the Confucian Association. Periodically, Qing Ho held a banquet for its members and collected contributions to pay for the food and the entertainment. The contributions were usually greater than the cost of the banquet, and Qing Ho kept the difference. Since the Confucians of the whole district contributed, the income was large. This association undertook another service to members, from which the income was also considerable. This was spirit talking. For a sum of money or grain, one could talk, with the aid of a medium, to a parent long dead. This was called yuan guang, the distant view. For an equivalent sum, one could talk to one who had just died. This was called Hui Yin, the return impression. Payments for both types of messages were paid to Qing Ho, who managed the whole procedure. The ability to arrange these conversations with the dead gave him awesome power over that wide cross-section of the people who believed in this occult practice. To round out his career, Sheng Qing Ho was active in politics. He served for many years as village head under the administration of Shanxi's governor, Yan Xishan. This office carried with it no salary, but it put the incumbent in a position to receive all kinds of emoluments, gifts and invitations to feasts on holidays, favors in return for the arbitration of disputes between families, graft in the collection of taxes and the assembling of materials for public works, commissions on the handling of public funds of all kinds. By far the largest source of Qing Ho's administrative take came from the cut he took of all taxes. If the county magistrate demanded 2 bushels of grain per family, he demanded 5 and kept 3. He accepted no excuse for failure to pay. People had to deliver their tax grains, even if they had to sell their children to do it. In fairness to Qing Ho, it must be added that of the 3 bushels he held back, only a portion went into his own granary. He had to split the taxes many ways with subordinate officials, soldiers, etc. Since Longbow was the district seat and a garrison town, in addition to the frequent tax collections, the population had to bear the burden of feeding soldiers and officers who walked in and demanded meals. If anyone offered them coarse food such as millet, they threw it in the privy. They wanted good things to eat. They often went to the village inn, ate their fill, and made the people pay, but they never bothered Qing Ho in such petty ways. They depended on him for tax gathering, public administration, and the adjustment of community disputes. It was Qing Ho himself who invited officers to his home, entertained them lavishly, fed them wheat dumplings, and gave them the finest tobacco to smoke. He, of course, paid for all this with public funds. As village head, Sheng Qing Ho was also a member of the Guomindang party. Although, out of prudence, he resigned from village office just before the Japanese conquerors arrived. He kept up his Guomindang membership throughout the occupation and the subsequent surrender in 1945. The power which Qing Ho wielded by means of these various connections was enormous in terms of village life. He used it to acquire wealth and more wealth. He was especially vigorous in taking over other people's land and houses. Han Sheng was an old man who owned half an acre of very good land just to the east of the village. In a crisis, he once borrowed $13 from Sheng Qing Ho. 3 years later, the principal plus interest amounted to a very large sum. Though Han Sheng paid off some of it, he couldn't pay it all. Qing Ho then seized the half-acre and the summer harvest that had just been reaped on it. Because he did not want the millet, he plowed it under the planted wheat in the fall. Han Sheng was left with nothing. The middle peasant Shi Tzu Har borrowed $125 from the North Temple Society managed by Qing Ho. 2 years later, when Zuhar was unable to pay, he lost his land, all 6 acres, his 11-section house, his donkey, and his cart. Footnote: a section of a Chinese house is from 6 to 9 feet wide, and may or may not be marked off by a partition. It is determined by the distance between the main rafters, which hold up the roof. The whole family, including several very young children, were driven outside to live in the open. Luckily, Zuhar had both local friends and skill as a carpenter. Luckily, Zuhar had both loyal friends and skill as a carpenter. He found shelter and work and was able to save his family from starvation. At the time when Qingho took possession of Zuhar's land, it had just been planted. The young millet shoots were pushing through the soil, and they had been hoed once. Qingho put the land up for sale, but the price he asked was so high that no one could afford to buy it. Though weeds smothered the young millet, Qingho would not allow Zuhar to go in the field, and the crop was lost. A poor peasant named Shen borrowed $4 from Qingho in order to buy medicine for his sick wife. As a guarantee for the loan, he indentured his son Fa Liang to Qingho for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, because of illness, deductions for broken tools, and outright cheating on the part of Qingho, Fa Liang owed many times the original debt and had to tear down part of his house and sell the roof timbers to win his freedom. The landless and the land poor were not the only victims of Sheng Qingho. A prosperous rich peasant, Pei Houyi, owned 13 acres and a fine house of 20 sections. This house adjoined Qingho's, and the landlord wanted very much to add it to his own. In order to do so, he first had to bankrupt Houyi. He encouraged Houyi to smoke opium, and when Houyi could no longer afford to buy opium, he loaned him the money with which to keep the supply coming. When Houyi's debt had grown to alarming proportions, Qingho decided to form a revolving loan society by means of which, in the course of several years, Houyi could pay off his debt. Quite a few peasants were drawn into this scheme. Each contributed 3 or 4 silver dollars to a fund, which each in turn could use interest-free for a year. Houyi was made secretary of the society and got the first year's pot. Since he was floating in an opium trance most of the time, Houyi easily lost track of the exact standing of the shares, and when Qingho suddenly announced that $50 was missing, he had no way to refute it. Qingho came forward with a solution. He took Houyi's house and 3 acres of his land in return for paying off the other partners. To settle the rest of the debt to Qingho, Houyi had to sell what remained of his land. Completely bankrupt, he and his family were driven into the street and forced to leave Longbow. Next to Sheng Qingho, the most important landlord in Longbow village was the Catholic Fan Pu-tzu. He owned 14 acres of land, a flock of sheep, several hogs, a distillery, larger than the one run by Qingho, and a liquor store in Horse Square, 1 mile to the north. He employed 2 full-time laborers, 2 shepherds, 3 distillery workers, 2 clerks, and seasonal help when needed. His household was notorious for the bad treatment meted out to laborers and servants. He paid one youthful worker in the distillery $7 a year, called him off the straw in the cowshed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and set him to grinding grain. At noon, when the whole family took a nap, this boy was not allowed to rest, but had to carry water. In the afternoon, the family ate an extra meal of noodles, but the laborers got only the 2 regular meals of coarse millet and corn dumplings. Among the rich peasants, men who themselves labored on the land but earned more through exploitation than they did by their own labor, Guo Fu Wang and his brother Chung Wang were the best known. In fact, they were considered to be the meanest employers in the whole village. The brothers owned 22 acres that yielded each year close to 8 tons of grain, 2 draft animals, and all such necessary farm tools and equipment as carts, plows, harrows, and seeders. Part of their land they worked themselves with the help of hired labor. The rest they rented out to tenants. During the famine years of 1942 to 1943, Chung Wang had no mercy on his tenants. The Miao brothers had been paying rent to him for many years, but in 1942 they did not harvest enough of a crop to live on. Chung Wang insisted on payment in full. They offered him some of their own land. He refused it. In order to settle up with him, they were forced to borrow grain from others. After paying their rent, they had nothing to eat. Both of them died of starvation before spring. Pei Mongwen's mother, another of Chung Wang's debtors, also died after paying him back $1.50. A third peasant, Ho Pang, lost crop, clothes, and household furniture to Chung Wang. At the height of the famine, with the people dying of starvation on every side, Chung Wang collected all the grain he could and held it for speculative prices in an underground vault that served as the family tomb. He held it so long that much of it rotted. Guo Chung Wang also evaded taxes for more than 20 years on 3 acres of land that were not registered with the county. Guo Chung Wang also evaded taxes for more than 20 years on 3 acres of land that were not registered with the county. His official deeds called for 3 acres less than he actually owned, and the evasion of taxes on this land threw an extra burden on the middle peasants, who had to bear the brunt of all grain levies. This type of tax evasion was common among those gentry with wealth or influence enough to bribe or otherwise pressure the makers of deeds and the collectors of taxes. Footnote: the word gentry is used here to describe landlords, rich peasants, and persons who made a career of serving them and their interests, such as bailiffs, public officials, village scholars, whose standard of living was comparable to that of the wealthy and came from the same source, the exploitation of the peasants. The acres so held were called black lands. The wealth accumulated by Guo Chung Wang, Fan Pu Tzu, Sheng Ching Ho, and the other gentry through usury, land rent, and the exploitation of hired labor could not easily be converted into capital, that is, could not easily be invested where it would yield a profit and reproduce itself with certainty. The returns from money lending were large, but the risks were also great. There was no limit to the number of poor peasants in desperate need of grain and funds, but few could offer anything by way of security. All the possessions of many a family could not realize $5 on the market. Children could be seized in lieu of property, but in a bad crop year, teenage girls sold for less than 100 weight of grain, and they had to be fed. A profit could be turned by making liquor, but there was a limit to the amount of grain available for mash and a very restricted market. People were willing enough to drink liquor, but they had nothing with which to pay for it. There were no savings banks. There was little commerce and less industry. The only thing left to invest in was land. Land was safe, but the returns were small when compared with those from usury, because scarcity drove land prices ever upward. Footnote: J. Lessing Buck, in his Chinese Farm Economy, estimated that the interest on capital invested in land averaged only 8.4% annually. Usurious loans yielded 30% a month and more. See R. H. Tawney, Land and Labor in China, London, George Allen and Unwin, Limited, 1932, page 67. The amount of good land on the market in Longbow and the surrounding villages was never large, while prospective buyers were numerous. Improving the land was out of the question. Irrigation would have doubled yields, but the water table was too low for the donkey-powered bucket pumps so common on the plains of Hopei, 100 miles to the east. In order to bring water, a canal several miles long was required, a project that was beyond the power of any one landlord, or even the whole village. For such a project, county-wide cooperation and support was necessary, but the bureaucrats of the Yamen, county government, were not interested, so the land remained dry, while the waters that drained from the ranges to the east flowed untapped to the North China Plain. Money could have been spent on indigenous fertilizers, better seed, and improved implements, but there was no guarantee of any immediate return. A dry year could make fertilizer useless. Should the yield by chance go up, taxes claimed the increase. Under such conditions, no one developed fertilizers, seeds, or implements. The landlord's surplus grain was converted instead into coinage and buried in the ground. The loans that were made to the peasants went mainly to cover emergency expenses, such as funerals, illnesses, weddings, and the food consumed during the spring hunger, rather than for productive improvements, such as wells, plows, or stock. Once the money was spent, neither the borrower nor the economy had anything to show for it. Money spent on land likewise added nothing to the productive forces. It only gave the purchaser the right to demand whatever share of the tenant's meager crop current social relations allowed. It in no way increased that crop. Hoarding the remainder of the surplus only deepened and perpetuated the stagnation. A community in desperate need of development could not use the only capital at hand, while a fortune in gold and silver lay in secret caches underground. Peasants for whom an ox or a plow might mean prosperity were condemned to starvation. At least half the population sat idle 5 months of the year because they lacked the resources for handicraft production, for small local industries, even for the mules and carts with which to do transport work once the crops were harvested in the fall. The iron ore in the hill south of Longbow and the coal in the mountain north of Lucheng were never mined for lack of funds, while thousands of people in the villages between roughed it through the winter like cattle, doing nothing and eating as little as possible in order to make their grain last until spring. Unused resources, wasted manpower, declining production, these were the fruits of a system that in the long run could only bring disaster on its victims and beneficiaries alike.